All right, let's have a look at a few little things, tricks of the trade, so to speak, on various types of post-editing or pre-editing, even post-work, pre-work, to create other types of interesting-looking landscapes. You see here, for instance, there's a little bit of a structure or some sort of I don't know, some happening, right? There's erosion, there are some sediments, but there's also a little bit of alterations. If you zoom around, look around, there may be some domes. You see some structure here. I had some other animations or images also, like this one here. And what you see in all of these is that we didn't just take the initial Gaussian noise or whatever the technique was to create the initial landscape. We added to it a little bit, we modified. And so I wanted to show you, for instance, how to do something like this one, right? Because starting from perhaps, let's see if we have a original, no, I guess I must have removed them. Well, let me show you what they look like. If you do something like a render plasma noise, there it is, not Gaussian, plasma noise. That's a starting point that's very interesting, and we've seen how to do the river canyon, how to add a little bit of a carved region as well by starting with something different, like what was it, the gradient, linear gradient tool. And so you could do, for instance, something like I know, a gradient like this. This one is interesting because it also has a little bit of color. Or maybe I have my selection, let's clear this and not show the alpha overlay. So yeah, this is the gradient, maybe a sunset gradient or something like that, but we'll use it for canyon, so maybe we'll turn it to grayscale and just this image, not the animation at this time. And then also expand the dynamic range a little bit, and so we have, you know, a typical starting point with some gradients. And remember, in some of the many other tutorials, we did a render plasma noise in not in the opaque mode, but in difference mode, so that we would see along this canyon a little bit of a river going there. And so that gives us additional little details. Well, there are other types of details that we can add, right? And the whole purpose of this is to go eventually into the Transform 3D Designer to create a nice, interesting looking background scene, a landscape, a mountain. You see this one here, just created. It remembered the parameters I had a little bit earlier with some puffy clouds here or there. And depending on how you set your camera zoom, you might feel like you're looking at it from far away, or you might be sitting in that scene. So lots of different ways to change the mood on that. Same thing with the amount of fog, the extrusion depth, right? These mountains might not be that high after all. You might have the zenith a little bit farther away. Perhaps the brightness is too intense. Perhaps there's a little bit too much of specular, and so on. So you know, we've done this a few times, and not a few too many. There's never too many. But one thing we can do is perhaps add a little bit a different look, rather than this rugged, very new landscape. I'm thinking if we had some way to create a little bit of, I don't know, something like as if it was formed by lava, by magma, by formations like continental drift, rather than just these mountains sticking out like that. What if we had a way to give a little bit of additional structure and flow, something like you know, as if it were liquid that eventually froze. So let's go and do just that. Let's go. Okay, we can freeze this one or render it. But what we'll do is see how we can work on that elevation map before we go into rendering this, right? So here's the rendering. Let's go store this. It's an interesting one. We might get back to it, but let's go back to the elevation map we had just before that. So I'm going to need to get my undo. There it is. So other things you can do with this elevation map is to simply use a morph tool in the same toolbar. You see the gradients here below the curve tool. Where the gradients, lens flare, special effects, right click on that and you'll see a couple of presets. In fact, if you left click, you'll see below the menu bar there is a second context bar, and there will be some options here too. That's where you'll see the warp option, warping an image. And so the warp option starts with maximum level 2 on the bias, and so you can shape this and reshape it, which is actually a very interesting tool also to create things like a magnetic field on the surface of the sun. If you want to have some sort of a a way to control or affect that somewhat. But I find it really interesting also if you reduce the bias here. You have all sorts of blobbiness showing here. This is great with cartoon characters that you want to make dance, or anything, any image, any photograph that you want to do a little bit of a morphed deformation to. So what I'll do is I'll actually use that to create a slightly different appearance on my elevation map, right? So my elevation map, I can start from the outside, and you see how it kind of creates these streaks and flow patterns. And you can do some short ones. You can click and drag just for a short duration, and just very quickly you create a very different looking landscape, or at least the elevation map of such a landscape. And then of course you might say, well, that's nice, but it's perhaps a little bit too intense, right? Let's take a look at it. Let's first store this and render it with the Puppy Ray, no, with the 3D Designer. It could be Puppy Ray too, for the ray tracer. So here we go, and you see now quite a different landscape from the previous one, right? Because we now have these flows and these ridges, and it looks like a very interesting. Look at this area here. This is what really looks interesting. Let's go and reduce the anti-aliasing down just to a small minimum value, so it's done a little bit faster. Because all we want to do is see, look at how we created kind of structures that are a little bit different from just the original. Now, sometimes that's good, but sometimes that's too much of it. Right. So what you want to do is really find a good middle ground between this totally deformed elevation map and the prior one. So this one here, no, not this one. Where did I put it? This one. Yeah. So this elevation map is perhaps too much of it, right? And let me see if I can minimize this one. So I'm going to go and undo to the level before we had all of these. Right. See all these transformations I did with the morph tool, the warp tool. I'm going to undo that and recreate, basically step back to the level where we just had the original elevation map from something like the River Canyon. There you go. So I'm going to store that one, and I have now the two images, right? This is before I apply the warp, and then this one here is after applying all the warp. And what I'd really like to do is be able to kind of find a middle ground between the two. I don't want to be with this, but I also don't want to be with this. This is too much of it. Well, what you can do is just fade between the two, right? You can choose, for instance, one of them, and then go to this one, and then use the fade last action up here in the upper right corner. It's called the interactive undo. So you can go none of it, all of it, or anything in between. Use that slider. So roughly 50% here gives you kind of a middle ground between the two. And if you want a little bit more of it, you go more into the 70 or 80%. And if you want even less of it, you go down to 20%. You don't see a number showing here, but you get the idea. This is 0 to 100% prior image, current image. And that's not the only place where you can do that. If you prefer to remember it as a filter, there is a color option here. No, excuse me, no, right up here. Fade, you can tell I'm not using it that way very many times, very often. Fade last action is the way to do it. That will do the same thing, except the slider goes in the other direction. So anyway, so that's one thing I wanted to show you, is that you can take an image, take another image, and then fade between the two to kind of do a quick adjust between the two and say, okay, that's the level of elevation map I want. You might want to also increase the dynamic range at that point to see if there's any parts that are not as bright as they could be. We should have some, if it's a grayscale image, there should be a pixel or a few here that are white. Maybe they were just off-white before that. But whatever it is, we now have a image that probably is more interesting. Let's store this one as a good one, a good step achieved. And what we'll do is minimize a couple of these that we probably don't need for a while. And we'll simply go and use the 3D Designer on that. So I'm going to go minimize this, get rid of some of these because they are just taking pixel real estate here. And I hope you have a large high-resolution screen. It really helps if you have room, or even a second screen, to move things away and focus on this one here. So what I'll do is I'll go to Transform, 3D Designer, and so now we have a landscape which is interesting in more than one way, right? Now we have some really rugged mountains up here, but we also have things that are a little bit more hilly and a little bit more soft, but we can still adjust the level of sediments. If you wanted to show as a new landscape, there are fewer sediments, right? Like a foreign planet for your game, you might have very little sediment deposits. Or if the planet has been around for a while and there's a lot of erosion, sediments will happen there. You can also adjust at this level the amount and get it to nice snowfields here. The coloring I have here is from the swap image, which I think is blank right now, but I can put in a new one if I want to. For instance, if I want to take this one here, create the texture, so a new color, and so that way we get some green fields and some snow caps and a little bit of everything here. Let's see, perhaps if we reduce the intensity and the smoothing in particular. This might be a little bit too harsh. Let's bring the snow level down, and so you see now how we have perhaps non-colored or grass-colored hills. There you go. The sediments can be colored. Let's give them snowpacks or rock. So a couple of different styles. Let's give it non-color, so we still have transitions on them as well. We can adjust the intensity of the erosion. Perhaps we have too much on the flatness here. Let's give it 33, and the rainfall. Let's see. Let's just leave these parameters as is. I think they're fine. What we may want to do is increase the pre-filter a little bit to give it a little bit more rounded look. And now let's explore. Let's zoom in a little bit here and see, what did we get from using that morph tool, the deformation. If we zoom around here now, if we look around, we can see that there will be patterns or shapes, like large curved areas like this here, and they are subtle at times because we reduced it a little bit with the interactive undo or the fade last action. We reduced it a little bit, but you can see that there are some shapes here, like geologic formations. That's basically what I'm looking for here, is to get an idea of give it the impression as if there are some geological monumental events that happened here, right? And so that will see, especially if you look at it from the top, but it all adds to that general impression of a really interesting landscape. So I wanted to show you some of that technique, some of these tricks, and we'll explore that in a few other ways right after that in another tutorial. This is a good starting point. Let's see what more. Oh yeah, the coloring of it, right? So I mean, I did the coloring here, but if we render that, maybe that's all we need. But there are a couple of other ways to refine the coloring on the texture itself, and we'll cover that in a different tutorial. We've done that already a few times, but it seems like every time we do, we find a few more interesting things to try as well. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.